Thank you all for coming to the second day of the GRCC Social Science Department's Race and Ethnicity Conference. My name is Bob Hendershot. I teach world history here at the college, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Rick Underhile. A few details for you so you know some of his credentials, which are very impressive. He has earned degrees in music, counselor education, and health education, and he's taught in each of those disciplines. His research and practice interests include the study of creativity, exploring how people learn, and how social environments can more effectively promote intellectual curiosity. He is an associate dean here at the college. He leads interdisciplinary programs and faculty professional development. In his spare time, he also is an epic runner. His talk this morning has a fascinating subject, and I'm really looking forward to hearing it, as I'm sure you are as well. The title of which is The Impact of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiments on Higher Education, A Story in Interdisciplinarity. We'll be following the conference format this morning, so if you would please hold your questions until the end, and then because we're being recorded for broadcast, I will pass the microphone around so that you may ask your excellent questions and that the tape can pick it up. But ladies and gentlemen, please help me to welcome Dr. Rick Underhile.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Hello, it's nice to be here. I'm flattered and glad to be invited to present to you. And so I'm going to give a talk that's a very complex talk, which doesn't mean that it's difficult. It means that it has a lot of different components. It has a lot of different pieces to it. And I want it to be fairly interactive. So in just a moment, I'm going to give you a list of things to think about and a list of things to take particular note on, because when I finish speaking in a few minutes, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about this. So let me tell you that, and then let me tell you just a little bit more about myself so you have some context. And context is an important thing in relationship to this particular topic. So the context is this. As Dr. Hendershot said, I have degrees in music, in counselor education, and supervision, actually, which means that not only am I a counselor, I'm a licensed therapist, but I also went to school to learn how to teach people to become therapists. And the reason for those two degrees, music and counselor education and supervision, is because when I was teaching music, I discovered that people were more likely to be creative and to be expressive at their instrument if they felt as though they were appreciated. And the more you talked to people and found out what they were interested in or how their school was going or what they were thinking about for a career, the more they felt comfortable being better at playing their instrument. And I thought how interesting it is to talk to people about their lives and to help them find a place in the world. And because of that, I became a therapist. I like being a therapist very much, and I found out that one of the reasons that people had distress in their lives is because they didn't have good stress management skills. They didn't know how to make good choices around managing stress. I also learned that they had difficulty in their communities. That is, they didn't have parks, or they didn't have well-lit sidewalks to go running on or to go walking on, or they didn't feel safe in their communities. And I thought, I wonder how I could make an impact on communities so that I could create conditions for people to have a greater likelihood of having health in their lives, because if people are healthy, they might be more invested in their communities, which is part of the expressive thing. So I earned a degree in health education. So a lot of what I think about is how do you create conditions that increase the likelihood that people will have a good time? How do you make people find environments where they feel connected to one another and they feel safe and they feel secure and they want to have thriving lives? So I'm very, very interested in that. That is an interdisciplinary background. I have a very interdisciplinary background that actually started out as a multidisciplinary background where I had this discipline and then this discipline and then this discipline, but then I put them all together into interdisciplinary work. So although I'm going to talk, the content of my presentation is really about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. The point of the talk is that this is an example of interdisciplinary work. And I'll talk to you also a bit about why I think that's important work to do. So there are 8 learning outcomes. So these are the things that I hope that you're able to do and that we're able to do together as the result of engaging in this conversation. Some of these things you may already know how to do, or you may already know some of this information. How many of you are familiar with the concept of multidisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity? Have you heard those terms? So you've heard a little bit of that. Good. How many of you feel proficient in that? You feel so confident that you could actually teach somebody what those things mean? A couple of you? Good, good, good. All right. How many of you have never heard of those at all? Brand new. Excellent. Okay. How many of you are familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis studies? Have you heard about it? How many of you know enough about it that you could actually explain it? Okay, good. So that tells us, that's very helpful to me because it lets me know how much detail I need to provide around that. How many of you had a health class and you know the symptoms and the signs of syphilis? A few of you? Okay, how many of you could teach that? You could sit down with somebody and say, you know, this is what you need to look for. This is what you need. Okay, a couple of you, good. How many of you have no idea? Had no health education? Okay. There's the concept of public trust, higher education, the aftermath of the studies, and the interdisciplinarity of this presentation. So I won't go through all those questions, but I want you to keep thinking about that. Is this something I know about? Is this something that I understand so deeply that I could explain it to somebody else? Or is this something I really want to learn more about? I'm sort of curious about this at this point. I'm going to come back to these outcomes at the end of the presentation and ask you questions around them. But the first one is very important. I would like you, as we're going along, I want you to make a list of terms, a glossary of terms that's useful to you and for any assignment that you might have. So sort of go through and say, okay, that's a key word. I need to understand that. If I understand that, I'll understand more about the whole story that this guy told us about. So multidisciplinarity is an interesting thing. It's a combination of disciplines. I'll go through the bullets, and then I'm going to talk to you about it for a minute. A combination of disciplines, and in multidisciplinarity, each discipline holds tight to its belief systems and its values and its assumptions around the particular thing that it has expertise in. Other fields of studies are intentionally kept separate. Sometimes you'll ask a scholar or a faculty member a question, and I say, you know, Mr. Light, I was curious about this aspect of history. And he'll say, well, you know, I really specialize in American history. For that question, you really should ask this person because they have expertise in history of London or something, okay? So it's, I know this, but you need to ask somebody else about that. So people gain expertise in a particular area, and they refer people to other areas of expertise. Experts in different fields work together, and each brings their own distinct contribution. Okay, so they might get together and have sort of a group project or a collaboration, but they each bring their own thing to the table. Now, in scholarly work, there's a respectfulness about this, and that is if Mr. Light teaches American history and I teach African history, I would never teach American history because that's what he does, and he would never make a comment about African history, because that's what I do. So there's a respectfulness about allowing each person to maintain ownership of the particular area that they have expertise in. So that's sort of the culture of that. So the example I want to give you is this. So if you became an expert on tomatoes, and you would know everything about every variety of tomatoes, and that was your field of expertise, and if you developed expertise on romaine lettuce. You know everything about romaine lettuce, and you are the go-to person about romaine lettuce. Someone else becomes the expert on cucumbers and knows everything about cucumbers. Someone else knows everything about carrots. And we brought you all together. We would talk about tomatoes and carrots and romaine lettuce and cucumbers. And it would be a very interesting conversation. And it might go in a lot of different directions. And at the end, that would be sort of the end of it. We would have had conversations about those 4 different vegetables and fruits. Interdisciplinarity makes you an expert on salad. Okay, you become an expert on how all these things go together. So you know something about all of those things, but the thing you're an expert in is how they blend together. And so you take a bite of salad and you say, the salad's good, but the cucumbers are bitter. That's the problem. Or the salad's good, but the carrots aren't the right carrots, or the tomatoes are the wrong variety. So you know enough about everything that you know how the pieces are supposed to go together. It's a blending of disciplines, and each discipline allows its belief system to be changed by other disciplines. So when I sit with my interdisciplinary colleagues, I don't want to hang on to my expertise. I want to take in other expertise. And I want to give as much opportunity as possible for my colleagues to change the way I feel about something. I'm very receptive to changing my worldview on something. The fields of studies are intentionally linked to one or more other fields. They're supposed to go together. Experts in different fields work together, and each brings their own distinct contribution. So that's still true. So in interdisciplinary work, you still have expertise in a particular area, but your ability to take in other information and see how it changes what you know is very, very, very important. Okay? So that's sort of the underlying theme of the presentation that I'm going to provide for you today is interdisciplinarity. This is important because it actually has a career focus to it, and that is when you go out, if many of you already have jobs, but if you go out and you want a particular job, the employer not only wants to know how you have expertise in the position title, like you're going to get a job as a sales manager. So you must have knowledge about how sales are managed. That's your job. But what other skills might you need to be a great sales manager? Name 3 things. Communication skills. You need communication skills. What else? Yes, you have to have the ability to supervise people, to be an effective supervisor, how to delegate out tasks, how to do planning. What else? One more thing that you would need in order to be a successful sales manager. Marketing. You need to know how to market. So your primary position is sales manager, but you need all these other things. All right? That's why college strives to prepare you to have sort of this global view, because you have sort of this repertoire, this toolbox of ways of thinking, and you never know which one you're going to need. So you want to gain enough expertise in each area and also have a lot of ownership of your particular area of expertise. So this is not just a concept. This is sort of just a very practical way of going through life, because you want to know enough about everything that you can sort of get through the community. You can be a good citizen in the community. Does that make some sense? You're good with that? All right. So the key to interdisciplinarity is the ability to see interrelationships. And there's a Sufi saying that's often used when we talk about interdisciplinarity, and the saying is, you think that if you understand one, you understand two, because 1 and 1 is 2. But you must also understand and. You have to know where things overlap. The ability to understand interrelationships and interconnectedness allows you to think through an interdisciplinary lens. All right, so can you give me a sense of what this picture is? This picture is of an event in Grand Rapids. Yes, say it again. Art Prize. It's a picture of Art Prize. How many of you have known or have seen Art Prize? Excellent. Is Art Prize an art competition? Is it a community event? Is it a business event? Is it an economic development effort? Is it a community promotion event? It's all of those things. So what does it take to make Art Prize successful? Business people, city planners, artists, photographers, planners, people who are finance managers, people who are promotion experts. It takes all those people. You can imagine the room that's filled with the people who make Art Prize happen. And when you come down, what can you look at? You can look at how it came together, how it's promoted, how the voting works. The T-shirts are so cool. You take the trolley through. Somebody's making the trolley work. Somebody has decided where the trolley's going to go. Somebody's decided what piece of art is going to be in what building or in what community area around the city. So Art Prize is a great local example of interdisciplinary work. All right. So you've got interdisciplinarity, you've got multidisciplinarity, right? So you've got those things. All right. Interdisciplinarity in public health is very interesting. So I'm going to start moving toward the talk about the Tuskegee syphilis studies. Merrill Singer is a medical anthropologist. And in the early 90s, he began to do research on a concept that became known as syndemics. Syndemics is 2 or more afflictions interacting synergistically that contribute to excess burden of disease in a population. What that really means is this. It means if anyone has a particular health risk behavior that is manageable and perhaps early on is preventable. And then they have another health risk behavior, and early on it's preventable and it's manageable. But something happens where this one makes this one worse, and it results in a third health problem that's difficult to manage. All right? So an example of that is substance abuse, violence, and AIDS. The first study on syndemics was called the SAVA studies. It was substance abuse, AIDS, and violence. And what Meryl Singer found out through a very, very, very large study in the United States is that people who were most likely to be diagnosed with HIV or early stage AIDS had a history of substance abuse and violence in their lives. And so what happened is more and more health providers were encouraged that if they had a patient or a client come in and they had a history of substance abuse, you would find out how severe the substance abuse was. And if it ranked sort of a 3 on a scale of 1, 2, 3, 4, if it was sort of near the high end, you would begin to ask them questions about the quality of their relationships. And if they had poor quality of relationships, you might ask them if they'd ever experienced any sort of violence in their family. And if they ranked that a 3, sort of a high ranking there, so they have substance abuse and they have violence, you would say, I think it would be wise if you were tested for HIV. And over 50% of them tested positive for HIV. So this became the foundation for the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in developing an effort to study syndemics. Now, syndemics is a really cool way of thinking because you can think about it in your day-to-day life. How many of you, I do this, so I'll use it as an example. How many of you experience stress? How many of you experience stress and then eat poorly? So you've got one thing and you've got another thing. How many of you, now you don't have to raise your hand on this. I'll raise my hand, but you don't have to. Okay, how many of you have had stress, poor nutrition, and then weight gain? That's a small scale example of a syndemic. Because then once you've gained weight to a certain point, it's hard to get rid of it. And then it leads to what? Hypertension, diabetes, all these other things that were preventable if you had had good stress management strategies. So it's a very, very interesting concept when we start thinking about the benefits of prevention. Because if you do this as students too, we do this as employees. You have a little problem, and then you add another little problem to it, and then you've got a big problem. Okay? So you begin to think about where's the earliest point that I can do something to prevent this small problem from linking to another small problem that's going to result in a big problem. Okay? In colleges and universities, there's something called General Adaptation Syndrome. Have you heard of that? GAS. Isn't that great? General Adaptation Syndrome. How many of you have ever had this experience? You work really hard through the semester, and you get through the semester, you think you're not going to make it, but you do make it, and then it's holiday break, and you have a cold or the flu. You're sick. That's General Adaptation Syndrome. It's your body's ability to sort of push away stress and illness until you sort of get to the finish line, and then your immune system sort of says, okay, I can't take any more. All right? And so you spend your holiday with a cold or something because the immune system is just conked out from all the stress that you gave it. Syndemics, the last thing I'll say about syndemics is this is another word you want to put in your glossary. The last thing I'll say about syndemics is in my work, I look at syndemics from a very positive perspective. So if you remember Dr. Hendershot's introduction, I think about how you create conditions that promote learning. So I think if this works really well and this works really well, I wonder if we combine them and solve a big problem. So if you have a really great, how many of you have had a, well, I'm not going to ask you, don't raise your hand, don't raise your hand, there are teachers here. You've had a great classroom with a great teacher and you learn really well. But sometimes you have a lousy classroom with a teacher who doesn't teach the way that you learn best and you have a bad experience. So what we talk about at the college is how can we have the best classroom experience as possible, and my work is doing faculty professional development. How can I make sure that our faculty have as many resources that they need so that they can be effective teachers so that you have a quality experience? How can you take this good thing and this good thing to put them together so that the most important thing has a positive impact? All right, so do you understand syndemics? You could go out and talk to somebody about syndemics a little bit now. You can go to syndemics.gov, syndemics.gov, and learn a lot more about this if you're interested in it or you wanted to write a little paper or something. All right, so here we are. This is looking at a cave. This is looking out a cave at the Camuy Caves. Do you know where the Camuy Caves are? In Puerto Rico. And I've said, warning, please be very curious, because at the end of this, I'm going to ask you more questions. All right, so we're going to have a little adventure here. So the Tuskegee syphilis studies began in 1932. And my presentation style is I'm going to go in time, I'm going to go to 1932, and then in a moment I'm going to go before 1932, and then I'll go ahead of 1932. So it began in 1932, and what happened is there were 399 African-American sharecroppers. How many of you know what sharecropping is? Do you know what that is? Do you know what a sharecropper does? How many of you have no idea? And I'll explain it. Sharecropping was sort of a transition activity, and other people in the room can say more about this probably, so if you have questions, we'll call on someone else to answer them. Sharecropping is an activity that was a transition activity between slavery and emancipation of slavery, where people who were very poor might share land of landowners, and it was typically a 50-50 thing. You come out, I'll give you this much property that I own, so you don't have to buy the property, but you have to tend the property, and then we'll share the crops. All right? Between the amount of work you put in, if you had a good crop, it wasn't awful. But keep that in mind. If you had a good crop, if you had good agricultural conditions, it wasn't awful. All right. So 399 African-American sharecroppers in Macon County, Alabama, were told by medical researchers at the Tuskegee Institute that they had bad blood. Bad blood was sort of a phrase used oftentimes by African Americans in the early 1900s, and it would describe fatigue and anemia and just feeling tired and worn down. It was sort of a way of expressing stress, all right? And it was when you became so stressed that you had illness, you had bad blood, that they suffered from bad blood. But really what happened is that those men were diagnosed with syphilis, but they weren't told that, all right? So this was a study by the Tuskegee Institute. I want to go back for just one second. So there's another interdisciplinary moment. These posters were made in the 30s and 40s. This came from the WPA. Do you know about WPA? The Works Progress Administration. That was a way of the government providing more jobs for people who were construction builders and road builders and artists and writers. A lot of very interesting work came out of the WPA. Have you been to the Meyer May House? That was influenced by the WPA, the architectural style. If you know 54 Jefferson, where the old public museum is, down on 54 Jefferson, right a couple blocks from here, that's a WPA project. That building was built with funds from the WPA. So if you're interested in history and architecture and art and writing, there's a lot you can learn from WPA. So this is a WPA Federation piece of artwork. A lot of WPA artists were commissioned to do health posters. Okay. So now you're learning about art, health, anthropology, history, some biology. Okay. So you have to understand Alabama. So I gave you a little snapshot of the syphilis studies. I'm going to talk more about that in just a moment. But let's go back and think, what was it like to be in Macon County, Alabama in the early 30s? Well, you have to sort of get there first, right? So in 1865, there was the emancipation of slaves, and there was a period of Reconstruction. So post-Civil War, there was a period of Reconstruction, and that ended in 1877. Alabama was an extremely poor, rural state. And the economy was tied to cotton, but the agricultural conditions were awful. So think about being a sharecropper. How much are you going to get from your crop? Because the agricultural conditions look like that. All right. In 1900, more than 45% of the population were African American. So nearly half of the population is now disenfranchised because of the political conditions and also the economic conditions. So now you're thinking about agriculture. You could think about meteorology, like the weather. You could think about geography, where this state is. If you've been to the deep south, you know it's very uncomfortable. In the summer, it's very hot, so the working conditions outside are very uncomfortable. In 1901, the state constitution disenfranchised the emancipated slaves. And I had to put a note here because I wanted to show you, because when I was preparing this talk, I didn't know how, I knew that happened, but I didn't know how extreme it was. So I wanted to give you a little quote here. So in Montgomery, Alabama, there's a constitutional convention. So each state writes its constitution. And in 1901, during the writing of the Alabama Constitution, they said, and what is it we want to do? Why? It is within the limits imposed by the federal Constitution to establish white supremacy in the state. And that became a key goal of Alabama. And so what Alabama lawmakers did is they created laws. If you go and read the Alabama state constitution, it's the longest constitution of all the states in the United States. It's more than twice as long as any other constitution because it has all these amendments in it, because the state capital wanted to dictate power around the state. So there was very little local influence. Everything came from the state. So it has all these amendments in it that you read. What they did after the Reconstruction is they told African Americans, if you leave the state and go north, you're not safe, you'll be killed. So even though it's bad here, it's better than anywhere else. So you need to stay here. All right. Even with that, there was still the Great Migration, which happened from 1915 to 1930, and about 175,000 African Americans did leave Alabama. All right, so go back now and think about who's left. Who's left? The poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable population, the most disenfranchised population in the state. That's who now populates the state, okay? So that gives you a sense of what it's like to be in Alabama in 1930. So what does that look like? If you just think about Alabama overall, in 1940, the dwellings of white rural landowners was $681, and black and white tenants at barely half that amount. So blacks had no ownership of anything. All right, 1.4% of those houses had running water, 0.7% a flush toilet, 11.5% a refrigerator, and about 20% had a radio. So you think about communication, or just think about social quality of life. What was that like? What did they bond around? They bonded around suffering and being disenfranchised. They had no plumbing, and they weren't able to really keep food very effectively. So it's really, really, really a horrific conditions in the state. And the houses, if you go back to a few slides, you think about those images, you know, dilapidated, unsullied, unpainted, unscreened, leaky roofs, outdoor toilets if they had any at all, and they were just beginning to get electricity. Okay, then you jump up 30 years to 1960, and a little bit more than a third, not quite half of the counties had poverty rates of 20% or more, with children under age 18 still most likely to be poor. And to this day, Alabama is still a very disenfranchised state. So now you begin to think about political history and geography and meteorology and agriculture and health and how all of these things are intertwined, okay? So now we're going to go back here and think for a moment, well, what is syphilis? So all of these men had syphilis, and what is it? It's a sexually transmitted disease. It's a bacterial infection. And it's spread through broken skin or mucous membranes, okay? So it can happen anywhere on your body if you have broken skin, through cuts and sores and things like that. Congenital syphilis is when pregnant mothers pass the syphilis on to their child during childbirth. Syphilis is widespread in the United States still today. It's not as prevalent as it once was, but it primarily affects people aged 20 to 29. And the symptoms depend on the stage of the disease, and many people don't have symptoms. And that's true even until the late stages. Syphilis goes in 3 stages, and in the 3rd stage, it's possible that you wouldn't have symptoms that you would notice, all right? So they may not be visible. So I'm going to go quickly through these. So primary syphilis are sores. They're canker sores, all right? And you may not notice them, and you may not especially notice them if they're inside your body someplace, all right? Secondary syphilis occurs 2 to 8 weeks, and about 33% of those who do not have primary syphilis will develop second-stage syphilis. Symptoms will also often go away without treatment, and they lie dormant. All right, so you could actually have had syphilis and never know it if you never had symptoms, and then it becomes dormant, which means that you could suddenly have 3rd-stage syphilis without ever having been diagnosed with 1st or 2nd stage syphilis. So the final stage of syphilis, again, another piece of WPA art, the infection becomes internal. The brain, the nervous system, the heart, skin, and bones. And the bacteria can be detectable. And at that point, it's very likely that the symptoms are noticeable on your body, all right? Now, I wrestle with this because I thought, because I teach health education, and I'm not the health education teacher that likes to show you all the images of sexually transmitted diseases, but I thought you have to see it. So you can see more vivid illustrations if you do a Google search for this, but I'll show you just a little bit. So this is primary syphilis. It looks like a sore. The sores are very, very noticeable because they have a particular characteristic, and that is they sort of look like a hollowed out spot or just a hole. It's like the skin, like the flesh just disappeared from that area, and they ooze a little bit. All right? It's attractive, right? It's good. Okay, this is second stage syphilis, and they become much more prominent. There are more of them. They begin to spread, and they have a redness and a yellowness to them. And if you were to experience that, you would say, something is going on there. This is not a sore. This is something that I really need to think about. And then the final stage of syphilis becomes very, very, very extreme oftentimes. And it can be on any part of your body. So again, I didn't want to leave you with that you walk out and the only thing you think about are these images. So I didn't give you the strongest images possible. But many people who contract syphilis have it on their face. They get it all over their face. So it really can be quite difficult to manage from a social perspective. So not only physically, your physical health suffers, but your mental health, your emotional health, your social health, and your spiritual health suffer as well. So it can be quite damaging to you as a person. So it's very serious. People die from third stage syphilis. So back to the story. So instead of being told that they had syphilis, they were told that they were going to be in a research study. And the study was funded by the Public Health Service. The Public Health Service came about from, well, who founded the Public Health Service? I'll ask you that. Do you have any idea how the Public Health Service came about? What was the purpose of the Public Health Service in the United States when it first began in the 1800s? Who were the people in the United States that we cared most about being healthy? Any idea? Children? Nope. Maybe, but not quite.
White landowners?
Nope.
Soldiers.
Soldiers. Who said soldiers? Mike Light, you win. Yes. Military. The Public Health Service was created to provide free health services to especially men in the Navy, because we needed healthy soldiers. And what was the primary illness that those men had? Be obvious. Syphilis. They had sexually transmitted diseases. All right? That's why it became so important to learn more about syphilis, because we wanted to eradicate it, or at least decrease the likelihood of its prevalence and severity among Navy men. All right? So that's an important point. So the Public Health Service was founded because of the military. Okay? And the Public Health Service is now the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The Centers for Disease Control was the Centers for Disease Control up until the late 70s, and in the 70s it became the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, although we still say the CDC. All right. And the CDC is part of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. So now you're learning about sort of government. Now we moved into government things, all right. Incentives for participating in the research study included you got free meals, free medical exams, and burial insurance. It's not wise to sign up for a research study that gives you burial insurance. We've learned this. The men were regularly examined but not treated, all right. Even after penicillin became available in the 1940s, and I wanted to put a little note in here because I thought Laurie Foster might be here. Penicillin was discovered in 1928 by Alexander Fleming, and what was it called first? You know what it was first called? What is it? What is penicillin? Mold. You know what it was first called? It's a fancy name. Mold juice. So it was mold juice, but it didn't. But people kept putting it on their skin like this, and it's like it's not doing anything. It must not work. All right, they didn't realize that you had to inject it. It had to be inside your body in order for it to work. So it didn't really do anything until it was clinically tried in 1940, and then it was mass produced after D-Day, which was June 6th, 1944. So now you've got medicine, biology, you've got some chemistry, you've got history, you've got all these things going on. All right, so this is an interdisciplinary story. So each of you is thinking, oh, I'm really interested in that because I care a lot about that. But I'm less interested in that because I really don't care so much about history, but I really am interested in science. So this is how interdisciplinarity works. So what happened? This is in 1932. The purpose of the study was to observe what happens to people with syphilis who go untreated. So that's the question. So how long did we want to watch those men? What was the end point? Death. We wanted to see how they died. So if you left syphilis untreated, what would happen? That began in 1932, and this is a whole story you should ask your faculty about. In 1972, an Associated Press story broke and said, this is going on. And people said, what? What? And it was a journalist who sort of stumbled upon it. He found out about it and he said, what's going on? And he broke this story and there was public outcry. Now, interestingly, the folks who were providing the medical care, these regular exams and providing food and sort of case management services to these men, were also included African Americans. So it wasn't just white and black, it became very complex. And the focus, think about this talk, the focus was, I'm a medical researcher. I only care about medical research, and this is what I'm doing. So they didn't think outside of their discipline. They thought, I'm a medical researcher, I have government funding to do this, it must be okay. All right. The panel had 9 members, so there was a panel, an advisory panel was set up. The study was stopped immediately. An advisory panel was created, and it represented medicine, law, religion, labor, education, health administration, and public affairs. A multidisciplinary, which probably became an interdisciplinary advisory board. They found that the men had agreed freely to be examined and treated. Would you like to be examined? Yes. Would you like to be treated? Yes. But we didn't say you're going to get treated for your illness. All right, you're just going to get treated. No evidence that researchers had informed them of the study, so they didn't know what they were in the study for. They just thought they were getting free medical care, free meals, and burial insurance. Now, how ill do you think these people were, and how many had already died? All right. The men had been misled and had not been given all the facts required to provide informed consent. Do you know that phrase, informed consent? This is a very important part of this talk because of higher education. Informed consent then became a law that in order to do research, people have to have informed consent. So if you've ever participated in any sort of study, you probably have to sign an informed consent form. And it says that the people doing the study have told you clearly what the study's purpose is, what the risks are, if there are any benefits, what the benefits are, and they have to provide you some resources in case you have additional questions, and that you can leave the study at any time. This was very controversial, especially in psychology, because in psychology, in the 50s especially, psychologists liked to do experiments with people, but they didn't know what they felt as though it was necessary to not tell people what they were experimenting them on. Because they thought, if you knew what the purpose of the experiment was, then the experiment won't work. So I have to sort of surprise you with the experiment, you know. And so it became very controversial about informed consent. There were people who said, you can't use informed consent because then it's not a study. So it completely changed the way research is done, especially in medicine and the sciences including psychology, mental health, my discipline in counseling, but the way that we want to see how people react to something, and we need to tell them what it is, and at the same time we want to have some spontaneous surprise value to it. We want to see an authentic reaction to something, but at the same time we need to tell them what's going on. So it completely changed the way that we do research. But what were the implications? Okay, so now we come right back to where we are today. Distrust is one of the reasons that the poor are less likely to take advantage of medical care and healthcare. And that's a very, very interesting thing because in studies, when I was preparing for this talk, there are a lot of studies that ask people, especially African American people, have you heard of the Tuskegee syphilis studies? And many of them will say yes, but they don't know what it is. They can't really go step by step and tell you what happened, but they'll say, I heard about that, and I'm never going to participate in research. So they don't know the story, but they know the sort of problem left behind, okay? And to this day, the number of African Americans in research studies is much lower than the number of whites in research studies, and the number of African Americans who are organ donors is much lower than the number of whites who are organ donors. So it compromises quality research, ethical research, and ethical medical practice because the government had sort of encouraged fear and distrust, right? So who's good and who's bad? You have to figure that out. So the study ended. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But at the same time, the damage had been done, right? Poor people are also less likely to take advantage of technology. So in other words, there's a lesser likelihood of people, of African American people especially, using the internet and going out and finding medical information. Within communities of color, African American communities, Hispanic communities, it's much more likely that those populations will seek medical advice from two folks. Who are they? They go to two different sort of areas of their world to ask for medical advice. They're social, they're family. They ask family members, this is what's going on with me. Has that ever happened to you? What did you do? So they go to family and who else? Friends. You're all kind of close. Particular type of friend. In many African American communities, who has a lot of power? Ministers, right? So in the 80s and the 90s especially, there was a huge amount of effort put into public health, partnering with communities of faith, because public health practitioners knew that communities of color often sought advice from their churches. And public health professionals, myself included, did a lot of work and a lot of grants work and everything and said, how can we better partner with the communities of faith so that we can get the message out there and make them our allies? And that became a huge effort in building trust and rebuilding trust. So it's very, very, very important. So the whole point of all around this is what happens when trust is broken in the community, especially around illness and death and things like that. Okay. It also has major changes in how had to be made in how research is conducted, and that's institutional review boards. So who was the leader in making changes to the way research is done? Colleges and universities. Because colleges and universities are the primary sort of funding way, the vehicle for funding for doing a lot of research. A lot of the most important research comes out of universities and colleges. So institutional review boards, those are offices that are made up of professionals who set the standards on how research can be conducted at a college or university of any sort. They then make the determination for those parameters. And anytime a study is done, the study has to be reviewed by them and recommendations are made. For those of you who already have graduate degrees or may pursue a graduate degree, you remember or you will learn about the experience of having to go through institutional review board. In graduate programs, it's not uncommon to actually have a class in ethics in research because of the Tuskegee syphilis studies. So in many ways, it made us stronger because we began to really entertain sort of all the implications of these things. Like, well, it takes more than just this group of people. And institutional review boards are interdisciplinary. They think about all of the implications that could happen to someone socially, emotionally, physically, intellectually. So have you all filled out any surveys here at school? Sometimes we administer surveys in the fall and sometimes in the spring, and there's typically a consent because it lets you know what we're doing with that. All right? Sometimes there's not because the institutional review board says, I don't think there's any risk of harm as long as you can let the student opt out. As long as you can let the student know, we'd like you to participate in the survey. You're not required to do it. It doesn't have anything to do with your grade, informing you about that. And you can choose to do it or you can choose not to, but we hope that you do. All right? And then you have a choice. So to bring closure to this, in 1997, so remember the story was broken in 1972, then the advisory board was created, and they made some determinations about what should happen. They ended the study. So in 1997, then President Bill Clinton provided a presidential apology. At that time, there were 8 still living participants who had been part of the Tuskegee syphilis studies experiment. This is Herman Shaw. He was the gentleman who was a survivor of this experiment, who was asked to be the spokesperson for the men who were still living at the White House. And this is in 1997. He was 97 years old, and he died in 1999 on December 23rd. But Clinton said, we face a challenge. Science and technology are rapidly changing. The promise of making us much healthier, more productive, and more prosperous. So I want to talk about that. Think about syndemics for a moment. In communities, there are 3 things that you need to think about. Health, greatest number of years of formal education completed. So the number of years that you've completed school. Health, number of years of schooling completed, and socioeconomic status, how much income you make. Those 3 are interconnected. If you know 2, you can predict 1. You can predict the 3rd one. If you can make any 2 of them better, you can make the 3rd one better. If you compromise any 2, you make the 3rd one worse. That's a syndemic fact, all right? So the more years of college that you can complete and the healthier you are, the more income you will have. The more income you have and the healthier you are, the more likely it is that you will complete more years of college. See how all that goes together? So when we think about cutting funding from health, it has a huge impact on education. Because what's the number 1 reason that students don't complete college? Stress. It's mostly stress. And so it gets really, really, really interdisciplinary and really, really, really syndemic around that, because stress leads to illness. Stress leads to poor financial management. Stress comes from poor financial management as well. Stress leads to poor time management. So all those things. So the more you can manage stress, the more likely it is that you can complete more college. And the more likely you can complete more college, the more likely it is that you will be healthier because you've managed your stress. And the more likely you do those things, the more likely that you'll have a productive income. So Clinton says, much healthier, much more productive, and more prosperous, because he knows about this stuff, right? But with these changes, we must work harder to see that as we advance, we don't leave behind our conscience. No ground is gained and much is lost if we lose our moral bearings in the name of progress. And then finally he says, the people who ran the study at Tuskegee diminished the stature of man by abandoning the most basic ethical precepts. They forgot their pledge to heal and repair. They had the power to heal the survivors and all the others, and they did not. Today, all we can do is apologize, but you have the power. For only you, Mr. Shaw, the others who are here, the family members who are with us in Tuskegee, you have the power to forgive. Your presence here shows us that you have chosen a better path than your government did so long ago. You have not withheld the power to forgive. I hope today and tomorrow every American will remember your lesson and live by it. Thank you, and God bless you. So it's a very historic event and a very debatable event for a presidential apology to occur. So you talk to your teachers who teach political science and history and government and things like that. Ask them about presidential apologies. That's a very, very, very significant thing. So it was fortunate that President Clinton did that and that Mr. Shaw was alive to receive that apology, and he did indeed forgive the whole Tuskegee process. And so it was a very, very interesting thing. So I want to begin to wrap up. If you want to know more about any of this, you can email me, or if you go online and just look for the 1997 presidential apology, you can get the whole script. It's about 3 pages long. So if that's of interest to you, you can see everything that President Clinton said about this issue. So here we go back to the definition of interdisciplinary. It's a blending of discipline. It allows its belief system to be changed and influenced. These fields of study are intentionally linked to other fields of study, and it's different folks bringing together their areas of expertise. So now I'm going to begin to ask you a series of questions, and I'm curious to know a few things. So prepare, all right? So one thing is, what is the most significant thing, or what's the most important thing that you learned or heard or thought about during this conversation, this presentation? Tell me a little bit about what you're thinking. Yes, please. Mr. Light will assist. Dr. Hendershot will assist. What's the most important thing that you think, if you were going to tell somebody this story, or you wanted to pass along this story to someone in your family or someone you cared about, what's the one thing that you would want them to know? Yes, ma'am.
It changed the way we do research.
It changed the way we do research. And say a little bit more about that. What about the way we change research?
How there's rules to govern it so that other people don't get hurt like they did in the Tuskegee trials.
Yes, it changed the way we do things to protect people, to ensure that it decreases the likelihood that people will be injured or hurt or left ill through a research process. So that's a very good thing. Anything else? Something else? Two more things that you would tell somebody else about this presentation. Or if you're writing a paper, what would be your thesis?
Do you want us just to pick on people?
Yes,
and
please.
Hand the microphone to them?
Yes.
All right.
Come on. I have to think here. Probably how they wanted people to be affected, like forgiveness, and how they thought about the whole event publicly, how it, like it wasn't small, but like in one area, and it affected like the whole nation.
Yes, and I think that's a very good observation, because in some ways, and this is your power and your ability as a citizen, is that this happened in a small rural community to fewer than 500 people. And the government could have easily have sort of acted like that didn't happen. But the ability of the government to say, wait a minute, we have to face up to this, because what happened to 399 people affects all of us. It affects all of us. And we, in order to recover from that, from the 399 people, we have to make apologies to every person who lives in the United States. So that's a very, very significant point, is the ability of the government to have enough humility to say, we didn't do a good job, and we need to tell you that, and we're going to try harder. So good. One more thing that sounded significant to you, or that you might tell someone. Roving.
Hand it to them. Whoever. Just hand it to somebody.
Syphilis can be found in any part of your body.
Yeah. Because we think about it being a sexually transmitted disease, so we think about syphilis and genitalia. But when you do a search for it, you can see that it can be on your hands, it can be on your feet, it can be on your legs. It can be any place because it's bacterial, right? So it's very, very important to be knowledgeable about that. So for people who have not had good comprehensive health education, as an adult, you want to be knowledgeable about these things. And we fund these things, right? There are prevention programs. So if you want your community to be healthy, you need to be knowledgeable. All right. I once gave a talk. I used to do a lot of work in HIV and AIDS prevention, and I gave a talk at another college that I wasn't working at, but I was a guest speaker, and someone said, "Wow, I guess we don't know a lot about HIV and AIDS in Kent County because it doesn't affect us so much." But Kent County has the second highest prevalence rate of HIV and AIDS in Michigan. So it's Wayne County and then Kent County. All right. So the whole sort of assumption that illness or that disease is over there, happening to those people who live far away, is a myth. Disease is all around us. That's just a reality. So it's good to be knowledgeable about these things. Good. What are the main topics? So if you were going to think, so this is an interdisciplinary talk, so it's made up of many disciplines. What would you say that give me some feedback on, what do you think my slant is? What do you think my primary area of interest is in this talk? What was the discipline that you heard most?
Public health.
Public health, yes. Public health, I once taught a class, and the question to the class for a semester was, who owns public health? Because we all own public health, right? The way that we vote, the way that we engage in health promoting behaviors, the way that we choose to engage in health risk behaviors, how we eat, how we sleep, how we drive, that's all public health. So we all own public health. So absolutely there's a public health perspective. What was the most, if you were to write a paper about this, which discipline would you draw from? Who would you need to talk more to? And you might think about scientists, biologists, historians, if you were going to fill in some of the blanks. So this is the question of what could I have said more about? If you're going to fill in blanks, who would you talk to make the story have more robustness?
I guess maybe a little bit more into history. I know you covered quite a bit of it, but there are also little gaps here and there.
Yeah, it could very easily turn into a history talk, a talk of history. And a talk of history, what I got tempted to do when I was putting the presentation together is to talk about what happened decade by decade. Because what I got curious about when I was putting the presentation together is what happened to those 399? How many died per year? When did they die? Under what conditions did they die? How were their families, what were their families told about their death? So it would be very interesting to do sort of a history paper on this, or a history essay or history exploration about that, or even a whole class on it is very interesting, sort of the melding of history and public health. So I appreciate you all coming to the talk. If you want copies of the slides or something, let your teachers know, let your faculty know, and they can get in touch with me. I'll be happy to provide these things to you, as well as the references. I also need to let you know that I'm very much indebted to our library and learning commons. Mr. Mike Claywitter was very helpful in helping me gather resources for this. So I'm appreciative of the library as much as the students are appreciative of the library, and I especially appreciate Mike for inviting me to give the talk.
Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you, Dr. Underhile.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yeah, it's fine.
Enjoyed your talk. Yeah,
Thanks so
that was
much.
great. This is a body of research that you